Hi everyone, this is Carey Shenkman. I'm a scholar with ISPU. I was trying to get online a little while ago, but was having a few technical difficulties. So let me know if you can hear me. I wanted to give a little PowerPoint presentation. I was filling around how to do those, but all my conferences have been on Zoom. I think like all of us right now, and this is the first time doing Facebook Live, so bear with me. But anyway, thank you so much for tuning in. Right now it's really been an unprecedented time, but I think in many respects, because of many things going on in the world right now, a lot of the work that ISPU is doing is more relevant than ever. The project that I've worked on for many years with ISPU has been one called Equal Treatment. So a couple of years ago, we released a report, myself and my colleague Kumar Rao released a report on the media and legal responses to ideologically motivated violence. I should probably take a step back and actually say who I am. So I'm a human rights and civil rights attorney. I'm based in New York, currently calling in from California, and my practice focuses on First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and constitutional law. Basically, I defend folks whose rights have been violated in different forms by the government, and also look at questions of public policy. So that's what brought me to the ISPU, and for several years I've been a scholar with the organization, looking at issues of ideologically motivated violence and the kind of disparate responses in our society to them. So a bit more about me and my work. So I've done a lot of work with the American Muslim community. I've been partnered with CARE in Los Angeles and CARE in New York for many years. I've brought litigation with both organizations. This past year, I've been co-counsel on several lawsuits with CARE in New York against the Trump administration in response to the Muslim ban and other immigration policies, and also done a lot of advising on issues ranging from employment discrimination to surveillance to other issues of public policy. So I think the topic that I want to talk about today is really personal for a lot of folks. It's basically a topic and one of discrimination, is how our society responds to different forms of violence and how we engage in the national dialogue, when these things happen. I think there's a wide-ranging perception, and that's what led several of us to undertake the study. It's a wide-ranging perception in this country that different people get treated differently depending on their identity in the United States, and it's a sad reality for some place where we are supposed to have equal treatment protected under the U.S. Constitution and as well under international human rights treaties. But there's I think been a growing suspicion over the last several years that being a Muslim or being brown means, more harsh treatment in the U.S. legal system and discriminatory treatment in the U.S. media. And following kind of that suspicion and that hypothesis, we decided to try to find some numbers and find some backing, because when you're going to politicians, when you're trying to advance policy, you can't just go, hey, we have this suspicion that there's an inequality. You actually have to have data. I think that's one of the great aspects of the work that ISPU does, and what I enjoyed about this project so much is the fact that it's kind of data driven. My background also is in math, so I appreciated being able to kind of dig through numbers in that way. So what I want to do is I see if I can I change this to a screen share mid? I think that might have been what the issue was before. It's not going to let me do a screen share, is it? The PowerPoint was so cool too. I'm going to take a quick look at this. But actually, it's fine if I can't do the PowerPoint. I'll just kind of talk through some of it. So basically, I want to start with a little bit of a story that gives a context of our equal treatment report. A couple stories actually, comparing what happened with different bomb plots over the past few years. So the first is a story of a guy, Justin Carl Moose. He was a North Carolina man, and he called himself bin Laden's Christian counterpart. So just keep that in mind. He's saying this was a Christian counterpart of Osama bin Laden, and he was charged in a plot to bomb an abortion clinic. Our second main character is a man, Buford Bucky Rogers, who was a Minnesota militia member sentenced on firearms charges, and he he actually, so Buford Rogers, he just had two news articles written about him. You're probably thinking, have I heard about these people? But you probably haven't, because there's next to no media coverage of them. The first one, Moose, he had no articles about him in either the Post or the New York Times. Rogers had two. Again, these are both alleged bomb plots. Each of them received a little over 2 or 3 years in prison. So not huge prison terms when you're thinking about bomb plots. So let's compare what happened in those cases. So keep in mind, next to no news articles and just a couple years in prison for bomb plots. Compare that to Antonio Martinez, who was arrested for a bomb plot in Maryland. Pretty similar facts across the board, except two things were different. One, he was a recent convert to Islam, and two, he didn't come up with his own explosive. He didn't make his own bomb. The FBI actually gave him a fake bomb as part of an undercover operation. So despite him not actually creating his own bomb, he had 10 articles written about him in the New York Times and Washington Post, and got over approximately 10 times the prison sentence as Moose. So he's sentenced to 25 years in prison for possession of weapons of mass destruction. So that kind of gives a sense of, the kind of stories that motivated this report. Why are two kind of categories of cases where the conduct is more or less the same, except the identity of the perpetrator is different. Why are those cases being treated differently, not only in the media, but in our legal system, which is supposed to be unbiased? So you've probably heard similar stories like this. It's something that's received a lot more attention, especially under the Trump administration. But something that we also wanted to draw attention to is that these trends aren't new under Trump. Islamophobia in the United States isn't a new development under Trump. While a lot of folks may have been empowered, and we're seeing a lot more of that coming overtly from the administration. A lot of the cases that we studied and talked about, like the cases that I just mentioned, actually developed over the Obama administration and that Justice Department. So these are problems that are often bipartisan in their nature, and that's why especially we need to approach them with data. In doing this report, we got a lot of really wonderful feedback. So my co-author and I, we published an op-ed in the New York Daily News. It got coverage in The Intercept. We had a launch event at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. a couple years ago. We've also given conferences talking about these trends with reporters. We've also spoken to politicians. Our team, we talked to Representative Andre Carson. We've had briefings with the Justice Department. We've spoken to Senator Kamala Harris. So we've had some serious engagement from policymakers on this, which is promising. There's definitely been interest, but we do feel that there's a lot more that can be done. This has also really been in the news recently. Just a couple days ago, there's a story that came out that the U.S. is going to give the terrorist label to a white supremacist group for the first time, and that was in response to a group called the Russian Imperial Movement. And this is a really big development because generally foreign terrorist organizations have almost exclusively been perceived to be ideologically Muslim, and there's almost seemed to be a preference by the State Department and others within government to label, to disproportionately label religious groups as under the label of terrorism. And we also saw just last month that the FBI announced that racist violence was an equal priority to foreign terrorism. I've been working on an op-ed where I'm actually saying that this doesn't go far enough, because I think that white supremacist terrorism is actually a greater threat than groups such as ISIS. That might be a controversial position for some folks, but the data actually, supports that. When you look at what's caused the majority of violence and majority of ideologically motivated deaths in the United States, it's been from white supremacist nationalist groups rather than religiously, groups that are and individuals that are perceived to be Muslim. So in terms of our report, you can find it at, and I actually want to make sure that I have the exact link correct, but it's ispu.org/equal treatment. And I see a couple comments. I should look at the, gotcha. Yeah, actually, Kat, if you can, oh, you already linked it. Thanks so much. So you can click on that link, ispu.org/public policy/equal treatment to see a copy of our report. And that has our whole methodology and everything. I won't dive into that. I just want to give you a few of the highlights from that report. So basically what we did is we looked at two categories of people. We had category A and category B. So category A were folks who are committing or plotting violent acts who are perceived to be Muslim. Category B were folks who are not perceived to be Muslim. The reason that we focused on perception is that a lot of times media is not right. Like there would be times when someone's alleged to be acting in the name of religion and they might not be, and that's not, and that's not something where the reporting has always been accurate. So we don't want to feed into that. So in terms of our findings, and again, you can find some more detailed findings on the actual report, but what we found is that the media was using the term terror in reference to perceived Muslim perpetrators significantly more often than other perpetrators of ideologically motivated violence. So the difference was really staggering. In one case, in one subset that we looked at, the media did not use the word terror at all for non-Muslims. Also, we found that Muslim perceived perpetrators got 770% more media coverage in cases of violent plots. So that's almost 8 times the amount of coverage. We also found that there were significantly more references to religion of perpetrators for the category A folks. And I also wanted to read just an excerpt that kind of demonstrates the type of, the type of bias that we saw. And to give context, we were looking at the New York Times and the Washington Post when we're doing this media coverage. So they're actually, often criticized for being liberally biased, but we found that there was actually, in fact, a lot of language that was used that was uneven in its treatment. So here's, in response to the Colorado Springs shooting several years ago, here's a quote from the New York Times from December 16, 2015. Colorado Springs tries to recover as nation moves on, and the shooting in California, which claimed 14 lives, siphoned much of the national focus from Colorado Springs, replacing a high-intensity conversation about violence against abortion clinics with perhaps an even more intense one about violence committed by Islamic terrorists. So what you can see in that, or hear in that quote, is that you have one act, a shooting in California, and described in terms of violence against abortion clinics, is contrasted against violence committed by Islamic terrorists. And it's through framings like that that there's really kind of a dichotomy that's created between two categories of perpetrators. When you look at the abortion clinic shooting, that was an ideologically motivated act of violence. And in many cases, religiously motivated as well. Especially, when a lot of perpetrators are doing so. In my first example, I mentioned someone who self-identified as the Christian counterpart as Osama bin Laden. So when we're talking about religiously motivated, ideologically motivated acts of violence, these are not being covered in the same language of terrorism as they are when folks are perceived to be Muslim. So we saw this type of bias in the media side. We also saw it on the legal side. We found that folks perceived to be Muslim were much more likely to be prosecuted with severe charges. We're talking severe charges, terrorism charges, weapons of mass destruction versus possession of the means to make explosives, and lesser offenses. We found that prosecutors were way more aggressive against Muslim perceived perpetrators. Average sentences we found across our data set were around 4 times the length for Muslim perceived folks as non-Muslims. And we also found that undercover sting operations were used a lot more with perceived Muslim perpetrators. Actually, in 3 of 4 of the perceived Muslim cases, as opposed to only 1 in 4 of the non-Muslim cases, law enforcement was providing bombs. These were fake weapons, and this is actually, I think, one of the most startling and concerning data points from this whole study, because the undercover sting operations really give a sense of where law enforcement priorities are. And I think there's been quite a lot of reporting. This was actually a big criticism, of many political figures recently of Bloomberg, Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, for policies that specifically went after the Muslim community in New York and sent FBI agents undercover to mosques and communities. So we find that this data is kind of consistent with what many groups have been studying, but it's also really concerning because it shows that disproportionately law enforcement is going after and doing sting operations based on religious identity, which under our Constitution is simply not okay. We also found that prison sentences were far more staggering with Muslim perceived perpetrators, and also the Justice Department was issuing press releases more when it came to Muslim perceived perpetrators, 6 times as often in those cases. So it's really across the board, from the media, from prosecution, not just charging, but also sentencing, and the types of charges that are being levied, as well as press releases. There really were really disproportionate responses. So again, you can look at more of the specific data. There are a lot of really great graphics that the team at ISPU has put together, visualizing this data, and I think it really really important and timely right now. The part that I wanted to leave off with about the report before talking about some other current topics is that the reason these issues are really important is because, as I mentioned before, our justice system is only as just as it provides equal treatment that's not based on individual identity or religion or ideology. And once those biases begin to permeate the system, as we find they sadly have, that really undermines so many aspects of our system, not only resulting in some communities being treated differently than others, but also overall us being less safe. Because it means that these are not only bad policies constitutionally, but they're also not effective policies. They're not actually going after the real threats, and they're not actually following the data. So what we kind of came away with, and I think should be kind of obvious in my view as a constitutional lawyer, but that equal treatment, equal conduct really deserves equal treatment. So I want to give a really quick look. If you had any questions, you can type them in the question box. But I had a few questions that came in advance, kind of about some of the things that I'm working on, and also kind of some recent events in the news. So I want to turn to stuff in the news first. One question I got is, what's the role of FBI sting operations, the legal disparities between perpetrators perceived to be Muslim versus those who are not? I kind of touched upon that with providing bombs in those cases, but the sting operations have actually like a pretty big consequence in terms of the eventual outcome, because a lot of the folks who are actually getting these fake weapons are actually being charged with higher offenses, which is kind of weird when you think about it. You think that somebody who's actually making their own bomb would be being charged more aggressively, but it's actually the opposite. It's the folks who are subject to sting operations that are getting charged with weapons of mass destruction. Of the category B, the non-Muslim group, there are only maybe one or two cases in our data set where there are weapons of mass destruction. And these were, I mean, they were really extreme and wild cases. We're talking somebody who was trying to build like a death ray on the back of his truck. I mean, it was, and some of these, I mean, some of the category B cases are really intense, and they're not sting operations. I mean, these are folks who are really trying to put this stuff together. Um, so another question I got was the FBI warned this month to be aware of white supremacist groups looking to exploit the COVID crisis, and an alleged ideologically motivated individual was killed while trying to bomb a hospital treating COVID patients. Yet neither of these major events attracted much news coverage. What's the long-term impact of continuing to misrepresent domestic threats of terrorism? I think that um, while I'll add that we have seen kind of a shift in priorities in that the Justice Department is a little less shy about labeling white supremacists as terrorists, it's far from actually solving the problem. And of course, I think as the question points out, the media has a big role in that. We've done trainings with members of the media and we've seen a lot of engagement, but there's a lot more room for this. There's a lot of misperception in the media, and even in terms of folks who are maybe not overtly trying to, to give unequal treatment, but may inadvertently or without knowing it use language that is biased in its nature. So that's something that we try to touch upon is addressing those kind of more subtle biases that where folks are kind of making assumptions in their writing without realizing it, kind of like that New York Times excerpt that I read to you. So I wanted to see another question I got. What advice would you give to a young scholar looking to study in your field? So I've been practicing law for, gosh, it's gonna make me feel old now, but I've been practicing for approximately 7 years now. And when I was in law school, I knew that I wanted to do human rights law. It was a big interest of mine, but I didn't predict, the specific line of work that I'd be in. I think there are a lot of aspects of where we are today as a nation that I think none of us could have really predicted a long time ago. But I think I knew that I was passionate about pursuing social justice and civil rights. I knew that I cared about, kind of giving back to communities and also trying to use my work to make a difference in the world. So I think following that instinct is really important to the extent that you can. So if you're a young scholar, if you're kind of getting started, or just interested in these issues, I think being engaged is really important. A lot of folks, if you just shoot them an email, like I get messages on my ISPU account. I actually recently, I think a couple weeks ago, actually got an email from a high school student who was doing a report on the Patriot Act, and I was really touched to have that kind of outreach. And I'll respond to questions like that. I mean, even a lot of journalists, a lot of scholars are on Twitter right now, so it's actually really easy to engage with folks. And I think that's what I really recommend is be part of that conversation. Don't think just because you're young or just because you haven't, been to law school or don't have such and such degree, that doesn't mean that you can't be part of that conversation. In fact, actually, a lot of the best insights that we've gotten have been from folks who are not necessarily in the legal world or in this world. So I wouldn't sell yourself short. If you have an instinct or a question, there's no question that's a stupid question ever. Because I mean, honestly, a lot of the questions that folks might ask or be shy to ask, they're the types of questions we get asked when we're doing these policy briefings on Capitol Hill. It's not like policymakers are, suddenly operating on this much higher level. Like we're getting very basic questions from the press, from the legal world. I think really being engaged, caring about these issues is important. In terms of COVID right now, I think, we're gonna, I think that some of the issues present in this report, I fear, might manifest in different forms of discrimination. I think we're starting to see that with discrimination against Asian Americans. We've seen that with physical assaults and also some of the media coverage surrounding China. So I think a lot of the lessons that we're learning now. I think I've also seen some pretty Islamophobic statements appear on my Twitter. So I think there are a lot of folks who will use any crisis and any pandemic to try to, perpetuate inequality. And it's important to kind of keep eyes on what's most important right now. If there weren't any other questions, I was going to wrap up in just a minute. I'm trying to see, Kat, if there's anything that I missed. I guess there's some interest in what's upcoming for me. I've just been doing a lot of Zoom calls. I think like everyone else, a lot of presentations in quarantine, and trying to do what I can. I've been trying to get involved in some volunteering efforts too, and reach out because the situation in New York is quite bad right now. So that's where I'm at. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. Salam alaikum. Actually, I think I think I wanted to respond to something else, but I'll leave it there. Salam alaikum, and peace be upon you all. I'm wishing much health to you and your families, inshallah, and yeah, please stay tuned. ISPU's coverage, I think, has been really fantastic on this. There's going to be another wisdom. I think, what are these called? Wisdom Wednesday. I titled this. I should probably know. This is, I think, Wisdom Wednesday hashtag. So tune in next week. There's going to be more coverage like this. So take care, everyone.